Hello everyone, welcome to The Negative, and in this video we're going to be asking whether or not box speed is the law. In my opinion, box speed is not the law, but it is a great starting point when it comes to rating your film. So your first question, if you're not already familiar with box speed, is probably going to be, what is box speed? And box speed is essentially just the ISO rating on the box of film. So on some films it'll actually say ISO 400 or whatever the ISO is. And then on other films it'll just be part of the branding. Like for example, Tri-X, it just says 400TX, but that 400 is the ISO. Box speed is a largely subjective topic. Most people would agree that the rating of the film is what it says on the box, but that's not always the case, and that largely depends on the developer that you use. So a lot of people have their own preference for developers. So my recommendation would be, if you send your film out to a lab, I would ask which developer that they use. So since developer is another huge factor when it comes to the ISO rating of a film, I would recommend looking up the datasheet for the film that you use. Almost every film has a datasheet to go along with it, and in the datasheet it'll tell you which developer was used to get the ISO rating for the film. And if you use that exact developer, or if you use a developer that's similar, you can expect the closest results or very similar results to that. But if you use a different developer, that ISO rating might be slightly different. So you can expose film exactly the same way and use different developers, and each developer is going to give you slightly different results. So depending on what your preference is, whether you wanted more shadow detail or less shadow detail, that's going to determine which developer you would use and how you would rate that film. So if you're following an ISO recommendation for a film and you find that the shadows are too dark, like let's say you rate your film at 400 and you use HC 110, and you might find that those shadows were darker than you would have actually wanted. You wanted more shadow detail. So you would actually decrease the ISO rating. So something more like a 320, and you would get more shadow detail with that developer. So the ISO rating largely depends on the developer that you use, and you'll have to test certain ISO ratings with your developer, and you'll have to find a rating that matches your desired result with that developer. So I actually shot a test roll of FP4, developed it in HC 110 and XTAL stock. So we'll take a look at some results that I got. Okay, so here we are in Lightroom. This is the FP4 example images. On the left we have FP4 in HC 110 dilution B, and on the right we have FP4 in XTAL stock. I chose the most regular dilutions possible to give like a baseline result. And the first thing that I'll notice is that the XTAL is a lot flatter than the HC 110. This is a lot more contrasty. The shadows look pretty similar on both of them. So this is the area that I metered for, this shadow right here. It looks pretty comparable on the two, but you can see that the contrast is a lot higher on the HC 110. The highlight areas are a lot denser. So this is going very white and this is a lot lighter. And you could kind of see that here in this area as well with the eyes. Looks like having a little bit more detail there versus just a pure white. So a lot contrastier on the HC 110. Shadow detail looks pretty similar, but this one I think does look brighter because those highlight areas are having more of a reaction. Like this I would consider a mid-tone, but it looks a lot brighter on the HC 110 because it looks like the density is more reactive in the highlights than it is on this one. So if we go one stop darker for both of them and take a look, again, a lot contrastier here, no difference there, but we start to notice that the shadows are actually darker on the HC 110. So better shadow detail here. Again, this is the same exact exposures and rating for the film, but different developer gives you different result and ultimately different shadow detail, which you can also look at as different ISO. And then we'll go again one stop darker for both. Still flatter on the XTAL side, still quite a bit of contrast here, more density in this area. And again, you can see that this area is a little brighter on the XTAL side, which ultimately is giving a different ISO rating than this one. So if you are using, this is what I meant when the ISO rating that you give to your film depends on the developer, because the ISO that you intended to get might be different than what you actually get with that developer. So if you actually wanted lighter shadows than as opposed to darker, like if you wanted more detail and you ended up rating your ISO 125 and you're using HC 110, you're going to get darker shadows than you are getting here. So if you wanted lighter shadows, with this developer, you'd have to decrease your ISO rating. So instead of 125, maybe try 100 or even 80. And you'd have to experiment ultimately. You always have to test when it comes to results with film, but this shows that the developer is going to influence your ISO rating quite a bit. So box speed is technically not the law, but it's a good starting point. So you can see these are very similar, but definitely not the same. Again, HC110 on this side, XTOL on this side. So this one does look brighter, but I believe again that it's because the highlight areas are more reactive in this developer, because as we decrease exposure, let's just go 2 stops on both. Now the XTOL image looks like the brighter one, and I believe that's because, I could be wrong, but it looks like HC110 is more sensitive with the highlights than XTOL is. So XTOL may be buffering those highlights and not giving as much density to them, whereas a brighter exposure for each one, those highlights are denser and that developer is working harder on them, so it's making them brighter. And then as we decrease exposure, we're left with better shadow detail on the XTOL side. So pretty close, but this one appears lighter. HC110 is darker. So you're not getting the exact same ISO. It's a little bit different. So your ISO depends on the developer, and that's ultimately going to influence what your final chosen ISO is for that film. So you can see from the results that the box speed or ISO rating largely depends on the developer that you use. So depending on which developer you use, you'll have to adjust your exposure either higher or lower from there to get the desired result that you want. So I would say box speed is a good starting point, but it is not the law. You'll have to adjust accordingly whether you want more or less shadow detail with the developer that you use. So I hope you guys found this video helpful. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you guys next time on The Negative.